Okay, good evening, everyone. Let's get settled down and I'll introduce tonight's speaker. So I'm Stephen Brooks. I teach political science at the University of Windsor. And I'm also a member of the Stephen Jaroslawski Chair in Religion and Conflict Advisory Committee. And we'll begin this evening, we'll actually begin this evening by reminding everyone to turn off their phones. And then we'll go on to acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional territories of the Three Fires Confederacy, comprised of the Odawa, Ojibwe, and Powhatan. And it's my pleasure tonight to introduce Dr. John Capucci, but let me say a bit about him first. And I'm going to follow my notes here carefully because John, for a young guy, I consider him a young guy, already has a rather long and impressive bio. He holds the Stephen Jaroslawski Chair in Religion and Conflict and is principal and vice chancellor at Assumption University, Windsor's historic Roman Catholic University, with roots that go well back into the 19th century, as many of you will know. He earned a PhD from Carleton University, an MA from Queen's University in Kingston, and an honors BA from the University of Windsor. At that time, I had the pleasure of teaching John. His research focuses on religious minorities and their treatment by the state. He's worked with 4 religious minorities. His refereed journal articles have appeared in several national and international publications, including, among others, the Bulletin for the Study of Religion, the Journal of Contemporary Anti-Semitism, Contemporary Jewry, Canadian Jewish Studies, Fieldwork in Religion, Journal of Muslim Minority Affairs, and Journal of Shia Islamic Studies. His 9th scholarly article on how Iranian Canadians perceive the treatment of Baha'is in Iran has just been accepted for publication and will appear in late 2024. He's been interviewed by many media outlets in Canada and elsewhere, including the CBC, City News Toronto, the Windsor Star, the Catholic Register. Some of you may have seen an article in which John was extensively quoted that appeared about a week or two ago, and the Detroit Jewish News. In addition to his active research agenda, Dr. Capucci has over 15 years of post-secondary teaching experience. He's taught a wider range of courses across the humanities and social sciences. Tonight, his talk is on his latest project, entitled A Forgotten Minority, the Christians of India and Religious Persecution. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Capucci.
Good evening, everyone. I want to thank you all for joining us. We have a great turnout, and tonight I'm going to talk about my research project. As Dr. Brooks mentioned, what I would say is one of my favorite professors, but there's a lot of other professors in the audience, and I don't want to get in trouble before I even begin, which is usually what might happen. Tonight I'm going to talk about the research project I've been working on this past year, academic year, on Christians of India. And when I talked to people about this topic, they said to me, "There are Christians in India?" And I said, yes, there are quite a sizable amount. You have to understand that India's population is a little bit bigger than Canada's. So if there's a few, if they say there's a percent or 2%, that's a big impact. We're going to talk about that tonight. I'm going to give a little bit of history about the Christians of India, and then what I want to do is talk a little bit about my research project and the individuals I interviewed and what they shared with me. As you know, last week there was an election results, I should say, were announced in India, and you saw a little bit of a difference of opinion happen from what the pollsters predicted and what the electorate did. And we'll talk a little bit about that and how that might have shaped some of the results that you're going to see. I should note this is an ongoing study, so if you know of individuals who might be interested in participating, they're welcome to do so. At the back there's some flyers on the study, and you can pass them along. So we'll do that, and then I'll open up the floor for some questions as well, because I know people might have some questions as we go along on this journey here. So first and foremost, as I mentioned, India does have a sizable population. It is the largest country on earth with 1.44 billion people, and growing quite rapidly. But interestingly enough, what people tend to forget is India is officially a secular state. So the argument would be, well, you're talking about religion, but this is officially a secular state. That's true. But in recent times, things have become a little bit more complex. It's not as easy as everyone thinks it might be. in addition to being a secular state, India is also the home to, at least the founding home, to several world religions. Does anybody know one of them?
Sikh.
Well, Hinduism, of course. Hinduism, we're going to spend a long time talking about Hinduism. Maha Sikhism, very good, in Punjab, which is in the western part of the country. There's two others as well. Oh, this class is a bright one already, I can tell. And one more. Not Islam, no. Jainism. Jainism is another religion which we can talk a little bit about. It's very small, but as I mentioned, if you see a small percentage in India, it's actually a big impact. There's also, which surprisingly, unlike Canada, India only has a very small percentage of people that are non-religious. If we shift gears and talk about Canada, the largest religion right now on paper is Christianity. The second largest religion on paper is what? The nuns. You're saying the nuns as in your church? I said, no, not the Catholic nuns. Nuns as in those who are not affiliated. That is the largest group growing in Canada, are people who are not affiliated. In India, there's a very small percent of people who are not affiliated, or what we would call non-religious. Now, we all know that Hinduism represents the largest religious group in India, and the second largest religious group in India, as you can see from this chart, is Islam, which is this part right here. I picked green because that was the color of the Prophet Muhammad's household. And then this blue is Christianity. So Christianity is the third largest religious group in India, the second largest religious minority in India. And you're saying, well, what percentage does it comprise? It only comprises about 2.4%. It's very tiny, but that translates to almost 30 million people, approximately about 75%-ish of Canada. And most of them are concentrated in the southern parts of India. We'll talk about that as well. Now, there's also Sikhism, which is mostly concentrated in the western part of the country, in the Punjab state. And then you have two smaller religions, Buddhism, which originally started in parts of India and then has since disappeared, or is very small, and then Jainism right over here as well. There's also another religious group that has had a historical impact on India that's not listed here. Does anybody know what it is? Yes?
Parsis.
Very good, the Parsis. The Parsis were actually Zoroastrians from Iran. They left Iran after the Muslim conquered Iran in the 7th century, the Sassanid Empire, and many of them moved to India. There's not many of them left, the Parsis or the Zoroastrians, but they are also represented as part of the religious composition of India. Now, as I mentioned, tonight is focusing on the Christians, and when I talked about this, many people were shocked that there were Christians in India, because India has historically been associated with Hinduism, and that's true. Hinduism goes back in India at least 5,000 years, but maybe even more. So let's talk a little bit about the Christians of India. Interestingly enough, most of the Christians in India are concentrated in the country's southern states. Many of you probably heard of a state called Kerala. And we'll talk about that because it plays a historical significance later on in the talk. About 1/5 of India's Christian population is in the state of Kerala. And I'll show you a map in a second. What's interesting enough is that there are, out of the, I believe, 36 states in India, Christians form a majority in 4 of them. There is one state, which I will show you right here. It's called Nagaland, right little tiny over here. Interestingly enough, that state is 88% Christian. And there are several others that form a majority as well in the western part, eastern part of the country. I was reading an article about Nagaland, which made me chuckle a little bit, is that this state is, does anybody know which Christian branch is most prevalent in Nagaland? It's not Catholicism.
Old Eastern Church?
No, the Eastern churches are more in the south.
Okay. Anglican?
It's not Anglican, but that's a good guess.
Syrian?
No,
Pentecostal.
no.
Syriac?
Starts with a B. It's the Baptists. The Baptists have a very large majority in Nagaland. And interestingly enough, they say that Nagaland is more Baptist than the state of Mississippi. I was reading an article, and percentage-wise, it is true that Nagaland is more Baptist than the state of Mississippi. I believe 75% of this state is Baptist. And Mississippi is probably about 50 to 55% Baptist. So it's quite interesting. You're saying, well, how did the Baptist faith, which started in the U.S., or England, U.S., how did that end up over here? Well, we're going to get to that question answer very quickly. And just going back over here, we should know something about the Indian Christians. In reference to religiosity, they're a very devout community. There was a report that came out by the Pew Research Center in 2021 that discussed the amount of devotion Indian Christians have to their faith. Here's a group that attends Mass weekly, prays daily, reads Scripture, so very devout in the Christian faith. My dear late grandmother, who I think about when I read this little point over here, St. Angela's Merici Church, which is an Italian church in Windsor, historically has been Italian. But now there's a lot of Christians from India going to St. Angela's. And my grandmother, when she encountered them for the first time, she was so impressed with how devout they were and how they prayed, and they wore the mantilla, which is the head covering, and all this. She said to me in Italian, "They're not playing games." She was really, she never saw that before, but she was very impressed. What I find very interesting is that the pew where my grandmother sat for 60 years is now occupied by a Christian Indian lady. And I thought that was my grandmother kind of giving a sign. So anyways, what's interesting about this is you're saying, okay, they're very devout, I get that. But then interestingly enough, they also subscribe to a lot of what we would call pan-Indian beliefs and customs. So for example, the Festival of Lights in India is Diwali. A lot of the Christians will participate in that festival. Another point that I found very interesting about the Indian Christians, and when I was reading this Pew report, was that they also believe in something called karma. Now, yes, that is part of the Dharmic religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, Jainism, fine. But I would pause and say, well, that doesn't mean that they're not subscribing to Christianity, because there's a lot of Christians in the West, probably in this room, that also believe in karma. So it doesn't negate that as well. But I thought I would point that out. The map of India here, most of this brown color right here represents Hinduism. Islam is in the top, the Jammu and Kashmir region, which you've probably heard some conflict in that area. Punjab, right over here, where the Golden Temple is, on the west, is mostly Sikh. And then there are the four majority states for Christians. But for our purposes, I've been interviewing people from this area, right over here. And I'll talk a little bit about my population sample so far. And as I mentioned, this study is continuing to grow, so it might shift. Now, how did Christianity arrive in India? That's the magic question of the night. Many people don't know or have theories on it, and there's a lot of theories that we could talk about. It's believed within Indian Christian communities that St. Thomas the Apostle, many of you remember him as Doubting Thomas, St. Thomas arrived in India around 52 AD or CE. And he arrived on what's called the Malabar coast, which is right here where Kerala is. This is the Malabar coast approximately. He arrived there around 52, for those of you that didn't see, right here, right at the bottom, 52 AD, and then with him and his disciples went around preaching the gospel all through southern India in present-day Kerala and Tamil Nadu in the south. He was eventually martyred, and there's a lot of hagiographical explanations on how he was martyred. Usually it was with a spear. I was just reading one a few days ago that said that there was a hunter that was trying to hunt peacocks, and he hit one of the peacocks with his spear, and then that peacock turned into St. Thomas. So there's a lot of that belief as well. But now I should note that some scholars dispute this, that St. Thomas did come to the Malabar coast. I'm not going to get into that because it's a long debate, but nonetheless, we do know the following. So those that don't believe that St. Thomas was actually there are some places in India that actually have the remains of St. Thomas. There's actually some reliquaries that are in both Kerala and in Tamil Nadu. The other argument that scholars are putting forward is they're saying, we're not saying that Christianity didn't arrive around this time in India. We're saying that it might not have been St. Thomas. What we're trying to say is that it was largely merchants who were coming through into India because of the very wealthy spice trade, particularly with pepper, and they were bringing Christianity into India at the time. However, that's one argument. Going back to the St. Thomas argument, the belief is that no, St. Thomas did arrive and he brought with him a version of Christianity that was prominent in what we would call present-day Syria or Iraq at the time. And hence the reason why there is a long lineage of what are called Syrian Christians, or the St. Thomas Christians, because they were essentially evangelized by individuals who were coming from Syria and Iraq, and they were bringing that version of Christianity into India. Now here you can see, this is believed to be the tomb of St. Thomas the Apostle. This is in Chennai, which is in Tamil Nadu, a state right next to Kerala. Now, I should note, as we go on over here, that the argument is that there was a group that actually was interested in what St. Thomas and his disciples had to say. Because there was a group that was in southern India at the time, they weren't Christian, right around here, northern Kerala, that would have been able to understand exactly what St. Thomas and his apostles spoke of. Does anybody know which group was there? Very good. The Jewish community was there. There is an ancient Jewish community. I told you we would bring up the Jewish community. There is an ancient Jewish community in the area of, it's called Kochi, but it used to be called Cochin. Right over here. And they were also Aramaic speaking. So when St. Thomas and his disciples came from the Holy Land to the Malabar coast, it's likely that he encountered the Cochin Jewish community and perhaps evangelized to that community as well. A lot of people don't know that. This community, by the way, for those that are interested, I know it has nothing to do with the presentation, but they mostly have left India and they've gone elsewhere. But there are Jewish communities, small Jewish communities spread throughout India as well. So that's a little bit of an interesting story that people probably didn't expect to pop up, but there's always surprises. Now let's talk about the missionaries, because we're going back to what I was talking about here, and you're saying, well, how did this become Christian when Christianity was somewhere over there, right? What happened over here? Well, the answer is very simple. It's missionaries. Missionaries were dispatched to India in order to evangelize. Now, this is where we're going to get into the politics very shortly. So what happened here? Well, first and foremost, as I mentioned, St. Thomas the Apostle was probably one of the first Christian missionaries to arrive, if we can consider that. If we shift forward a little bit, the Dominicans, the Franciscans, the Augustinians, and then later on, of course, the Jesuits also made themselves prevalent in India at the time. The Jesuits came with the Portuguese and were instrumental in evangelizing the state of Goa. You probably heard of Goa before. That's where a lot of the Portuguese and the Jesuits were there. Most of you have heard of St. Francis Xavier, who not only was evangelizing in India, but also did missionary work in Japan as well, too. So the problem, you're saying, okay, is this. An Inquisition erupted. Okay? And you're saying, well, I thought the Inquisition was mostly in, Europe, no, it actually ended up also in India because there were individuals who refused to convert. There was a sizable Hindu population in Goa at the time that refused to convert to Catholicism. In addition to the Hindu population that was not willing to convert to Catholicism, there was another group that was not willing to convert to Roman Catholicism, and that was the Eastern churches that were in the southern parts of India. As I mentioned, this was the Eastern Rite churches, which differed slightly, depends on who you're talking to, from the Roman Rite churches. And as a result, there was also conflict with them as well. So again, the Dominicans, the Franciscans, the Augustinians, and the Jesuits came. The Jesuits seem to kind of be all over the place, and they're the largest religious order in the Catholic Church still to this day. And some people don't know this, but Assumption University was founded by Jesuits. It wasn't the Basilians, and I know there's a couple Basilians in the audience. I'm going to get a letter tomorrow morning. But the Jesuits were only there for 8 months, and then they left, and then the Basilians eventually came. So, as you can imagine, with the Inquisition comes torture, comes the auto da fe, comes destruction of sacred sites, particularly towards the Hindus, and so on and so forth. So it wasn't a pleasant period of time at this point. Now, were there also Protestant missionaries? The answer to that is, you can see St. Francis over here evangelizing and preaching the gospel. Yes, the first, you might have already seen it, but I'll ask. The first Protestant missionary wasn't Anglican. A lot of people think he was Anglican. He wasn't Anglican. And I'll explain that in a second. He was actually a Lutheran. It was the Lutherans that were the first Protestant group to evangelize in India at the time. But he wasn't sent by the Germans. He was sent by the Danes, the Danish king, who sent him to a small village, actually, north of Calcutta, in order to start evangelizing, because that's where the Danes had a position at the time. So, as you can see, Bartholomeus Zingenbald was one of the first, and there's a whole book that was published by Oxford University Press just about him and his exploits in India. Then there was another group called the Serampore Trio. They were English Baptists. See, this is where I remember I mentioned the Baptists, the 4 states that were Baptists. The Baptists started to arrive in the 1700s, late 1700s. And one of them was, Serampore is an area north of Calcutta. The Baptists were quite unique, I have to say, because one of them, William Carey, was a polyglot. In other words, he spoke multiple languages. Not only did he start translating the Bible into Hindi, Tamil, Bengali, Sanskrit, and so on, but he also decided to translate some of the epics, like the Ramayana, into English in order to bring them back to England. So you can see that this is an interesting situation going on here with the translation of the Bible, but also translation of Hindu texts as well into English to make them available to an Anglophone audience. There have been other missionaries that have come. Amy Carmichael was an Irish Presbyterian, very interestingly enough, who worked with orphan and women in India. She worked with, they were called temple children. Has anybody heard of that phrase before? No? They were children that were kind of sold off to work, this was in the late 19th century, they were sold off to work in the temples. And it was almost like a quasi-servitude, that was going on at the time. And she worked with these orphan children, and she tried to give them a home away from that kind of life. But this was going on, as I mentioned, in the late 19th century. So these are some of the Protestant missionaries. And we could talk about the whole missionary concept later on in the discussion, but as you can imagine, some of this wasn't done in an ethical fashion. Okay? There was a lot of coercion, a lot of intimidation, a lot of force that was used on all sides of the argument. I don't have the book with me, but I was digging up in the Leddy Library, and I found a book that was written by Mahatma Gandhi. And it was discussing his opinion on missionaries. Let's just put it very gently, he wasn't a fan. Okay? And one of the arguments that Gandhi said, and this is all in just the first page of the book, so you get a good glimpse, is he said that when he was nursing his father, he met Jain monks, and he met Muslims, and he met Buddhists, and he had a respect for them, and his father had a respect for them, because there was a sense of dialogue between them. And then he encountered the Christians. And he couldn't tolerate them because there was no dialogue, and eat beef and drink alcohol and do these things that were sacred to his tradition up until a few weeks ago. So Gandhi talks about that. You might have also heard about Gandhi's famous phrase. He says, "I like your Christ, but I don't like your Christians." And a lot of that had to do with racism. So we could talk about the missionaries later on. There is also a little bit of a bright spot to the missionaries. Has anybody heard of the practice called sati or suti? Yes, what is it?
That is where the wife is pushed into the burning fire as after the death of the husband.
That's right. So it used to be up until the mid-1800s that it was the practice, particularly of senior ranking in the Brahmin class, that a wife, when her husband were to pass away, she would throw herself onto the burning funeral pyre, a self-immolation. And that was prohibited by the British, and we can talk about that later on. But that was a practice that many of these missionary communities rejected, obviously, and it was eventually banned as a practice. But that's what I want to say, that there was, a little bit of a glimmer of trying to stop some of these practices that were considered problematic. So this is a picture of Ziegenbalg and in India, and there's some missionaries that have statues still. St. Francis Xavier has quite a bit. St. Thomas is quite big as well. St. George as well. And some of my participants talked about St. George. Now, this is where it gets very complex very quickly. These are some of the branches of Christianity that are in India. Okay? So it's just not the Roman Catholics on one side of the corner and the Anglicans on the other. It's a lot more complex than that. So if we start off with the Catholic, you can see there's different branches of Catholicism there as well. You have the Roman or Latin Rite Catholics, which form the majority of the population. So if we assume there's about 30 million Christians in India, about 11.8 million are Latin Rite Catholics. Then there are the Syro-Malabar Catholics. Syro-Malabar Catholics have retained an ancient rite, the rite of St. Thomas, or that's been carried on, but they follow what's called the Eastern Syriac Rite. And this is a rite that is practiced in a certain church in Windsor. Does anybody know what church?
St. Ignatius of Antioch?
No, St. Mary.
It's the Chaldean Rite.
It's not Chaldean, it's the Assyrian rite.
That's right, yeah.
Old Assyrian.
It's the old Assyrian rite. So this is a rite that is still practiced today. It's an ancient rite. And then there's another branch called the Syrian-Malankara, which uses the Western Syriac rite. So you can see they're Catholic, they're in union with Rome, they have what's called sui juris, which means their own judgment, they're kind of their own autonomy, but they are still considered Catholic. And there are more as well. So I just didn't want to overflow us tonight. Within the Orthodox community, there's the Malankara Orthodox Syrian Church, which is a Western Syrian church, and then there's the Jacobites. And I have participants that were Jacobites that came to me. Again, this is not, you're saying, well, they both have the same rite. True. This is more about authority. One of the branches takes authority from the Patriarch of Antioch, and the other one takes authority from one of the, what's called the Catholicos in India. So in other words, we're going to follow a leader in India, or we're going to follow a leader in faraway land. That's the differences between the two. So I mentioned to you that the largest group is the Roman Catholics at 11.8. Does anybody know the second largest denomination?
Syro-Malabar?
It's not the Syro-Malabar, but that's an excellent guess. Syro-Malabar comes close. It's actually the Assemblies of God, which are Pentecostal evangelical. They are growing rapidly in India, and they are the second largest after the Catholics. They're about 5 million. So very sizable community. Then the group after that is actually the Lutherans. So what Bartholomeus Ziegenbalg did actually seemed to have taken root, because the Lutherans form about 4.2 million in India as well. And then, Father, you're right, the Syro-Malabar Church, which many people have heard about, would be another 4 million. So there's a lot of communities. Malankara Martama is another Protestant group, and they form a sizable group as well. The Anglican Church is obviously in India. It's split into two. So there's the Church of the North, which comprises most of the northern states, and then there's the Church of the South, which comprises the 5 southern Indian states where the majority of Christians are. So they form a sizable group as well. And as you can see, there's a lot of difference in how Christianity is practiced in India. Here's a portrait of the Mughal Empire Akbar, and these two gentlemen over here are Jesuits. Very good. Yeah. And over here is an altar at the Syro-Malabar Church. You can see it's the cross of St. Thomas right here. That's how it looks. And over here is I believe it's Pentecostal church receiving the sacraments. So very much diverse in India, how Christianity is practiced. It's very, very complex, as you can see. Now, where does the politics come in? Because religion has nothing to do with politics, right? But no. The politics comes in later on. So when India was formed in 1947, things, where there was a different type of conflict. It was mostly a conflict between the Hindus and the Muslims, and the division between India and Pakistan, the partition that happened there. There wasn't really much going on with the Christians. There was a study that I read from 1964 to 1996. There were only 32 incidents of anti-Christian attacks in the entire subcontinent, which is very tiny. So from that long period, that 32-year period, from the 60s into the mid-90s, you really didn't hear much of any problems. And then in the 1990s, you start to hear problems. And the question begins, what happened? Well, it's a long story, what happened. But there is a perception, as we move into the 1990s, that Christians are a threat. And I'm going to get to that in a second as to why they're seen as a threat. And that's what actually provoked this study. What provoked this study was, I was doing some reading online, and I was hearing reports from various NGOs about the treatment of Christians in India. And that India was passing laws in certain states about conversion. That they were prohibiting conversions from happening. So if you said, listen, I don't want to be Christian anymore, I want to be Hindu, or I want to be Muslim, or I want to be Sikh, or I want to be whatever, there were laws against that. And I was thinking, what's going on here? This is a secular country. If you read the preamble to the Constitution of India, it's clear that it is a secular country. So that's what's really prompted this study, was the conversion laws. Now, going back, and this kind of filters into what happened last week with the election or re-election of the BJP, is this notion of Hindutva. It's a word that comes from the 1960s, and it essentially means Hindu-ness. It's the idea or the ideology that India is a Hindu nation. And some would argue that, and some would say, no, India is not a Hindu nation. India is a secular nation. Others would say, no, Hinduism is so ingrained in India that it is a Hindu nation. A group later formed called the Sangh Parivar, or just known as the Sangh, or the people who are part of it are Sanghis, which is essentially a Hindu nationalist group. And so there's many Hindu nationalist groups that believe that India is a Hindu nation, and that religions that have converted, people that have converted to, let's say, Islam or Buddhism or Jainism or Sikhism or Christianity, were originally Hindus, and as a result, need to come back to Hinduism. And in fact, there is an article that I was reading by one of my former professors, Dr. Roy Amor, who just sent it to me, that there is this now mass conversion rite that is essentially bringing people who are non-Hindus back to Hinduism. And I was very fascinated to read that, because we have to understand something about Hinduism. Unlike Christianity, Hinduism really isn't a missionary religion, in the sense that it doesn't actively seek converts. It's not against converts, it just doesn't actively seek them. The same applies to Judaism. Judaism is not a missionary religion. It's not against converts, it will welcome converts, but it doesn't see the need to bring in converts, because your faith is your faith, that's great. Our faith is our faith, that's great. Also, Sikhism and Buddhism and Jainism, they're not really missionary religions either. I suppose Buddhism maybe can be argued to be a missionary religion, or at least it was a missionary religion. I don't know. But going back to this, it's Christianity and Islam which are missionary religions. It's Sikh converts. It's seek to bring people to the faith, which is something unique for India. And this goes back all the way even to before the British period as well. Now, the ruling party of India is the BJP. And they have been in power since 2014. You saw last week that despite what the pollsters all were going to think, and what we're all going to predict, I should say, the BJP didn't receive a larger majority than they already had. In fact, they received a minority this time around, which shocked a lot of people. We could talk about that as we move on in the presentation. I should note that within this SANG over here, there is something called the RSS. How many people have heard of the RSS before? A few people. Okay, the RSS is actually a paramilitary group, and it is a promoter of Hindu nationalism and essentially does a lot of the work of the BJP in the streets. There have been many actually incidents with the RSS causing some tensions between different religious communities. Christians, Muslims, Sikhs particularly as well. So this is of course the Prime Minister of India, Prime Minister Modi, and this is when he just voted. As you can see over here, he has the ink on his finger over here indicating that he's voted. So this is where we're starting to get the tensions now. That you have a political party in India that is essentially seeing Hindus as the norm, essentially, in India. And this is a problem because you have many communities in this country, which is a massive country, the largest country, that aren't Hindu and aren't seeking to become Hindu. And for years and years, we actually had friends that were Hindu, but now things have become very tense because of this emphasis on religion now. Before there wasn't, and I'm going to talk about what my participants have said about this newfound influence on religion. In 2007, there was a riot that took place, and this riot took place because there were some individuals, Christians, who wanted to put up Christmas decorations during Christmas time, and there was a conflict between them and the Hindu nationalists. Again, the RSS members got involved, riled up the population, and this resulted in a death toll of anywhere between 3 and 50 people, not to mention hundreds of people displaced. Again, this takes place during Christmas. On the Christian side of the argument, they also attacked one of the swamis, a sort of a Hindu monk, and that didn't help matters as well. So that becomes a problem. Now, I want to talk about this phrase over here, scheduled caste. Does anybody know what that means? You've probably seen it.
Lowest class.
The lowest class, yeah? Lukman, go ahead.
Yeah, like lower castes, when they had the caste system, so I guess there's sometimes, I don't know, what's that word, affirmative action.
Yeah, so in India there are several castes, right? So from the Brahmins or the priests, then the warriors, the merchants, the laborers, but there are some that are very low at the bottom. And they're called scheduled class. Years ago they used to be called, I think the British called them backward classes. Other terms like Dalit, you've probably heard of the term Dalit as well. Gandhi used to call them children of God, or people of God. The Constitution of India calls them scheduled castes. And the argument is, by members of Hindu nationalist parties, is that the Christians and Muslims are targeting the scheduled castes as a way of getting them out of their caste system and bringing them into a religion that doesn't have any castes at all. So this is where things get very tense politically. By converting individuals who are at the lower scale of the caste and saying, come to a religion X because we don't have a caste system at all, it's a way of converting. And this is some of the fear that you will hear from the RSS and the BJP, is this whole thing about castes as well. I should note that I did ask a question about experiencing discrimination. And some people said, no, I haven't experienced discrimination because of my Christian faith. I've experienced discrimination because of the caste that my family was part of years ago. So that's another issue at play here that you don't see in other religious communities. There is that caste component. Again, there was more riots in 2008, and this resulted, unfortunately, in the murder of the Swami Saraswati here that I was talking about. The Hindus believed it was the Christians, and it probably was. The Indian government actually was blaming the communists. It could have been them as well. It could have been a mix of both as well. But what happened was, nonetheless, this sparked a whole riot. 500 people, up to 500 people might have been killed. And not to mention there were destruction of churches, there were sexual assaults of women, and countless displaced persons as well. So this is getting to be a serious problem in the country. As you can see, this is a church in Odisha that was destroyed, and many of them have been destroyed over the years as well.
John?
Yep.
So was that, for the riots, those things, getting back to the scheduled caste, I've never heard of that term, scheduled caste, but those are what we call the untouchables, right? They
Used to be called the Untouchables, yeah.
So these riots now, is this throughout India or in those areas where Christianity was a minority, or do I scarce believe that would happen where the Christians were a majority?
I'm going to get to that. It's a good question, actually. And there is a significant difference between what we'll call the South and the North. And when I talk to the participants, they explain that very clearly to me, that there is a difference. But the South doesn't mean it's a Christian paradise, and so there are some issues there as well. And some of you might have heard of the Manipur riots. Manipur is in the west, the eastern part of the country, where the Christians actually form a majority in those states that I showed you as well. This had to do, again, with this caste system at play. In this case, there was a Hindu tribe. There's also scheduled tribes as well that are like caste but tribes, and they're mostly in the eastern part of the country and northern part of the country. What happened was that one of the Hindu tribes was given scheduled tribe status, and when you are part of the scheduled tribes or scheduled castes, you get government benefits as well. And certain seats in the university and colleges are allocated to members of the scheduled castes, right? So the Christian minority at the time protested that because they weren't given those privileges that this larger group was given, and as a result, a huge riot broke out. And this one was quite significant, resulting in about 50 to 70,000 people being displaced. I was speaking to some of my participants about this, and they said, a lot of people don't know about this outside of India. And I says, well, a lot of people are learning about it because as we continue to talk about it, people will hear about the Manipur riots. If you want to look at that, please do. The Supreme Court of India actually investigated what went on over here and determined that the police didn't do their job, essentially. That they were unprepared for what was going to go on and had lost control in Manipur. So this brings us up essentially to my research study and what I've been doing. And as I mentioned, it focused on persecution of Indian Christians, any branch. The study didn't take long. It just took about 20-minute interview, one-on-one with members of Indian Christian communities. And I asked some demographic questions, which I'm going to show you next, and then I asked some survey questions. And the survey questions, some of them were open questions. You know, what do you think the future of Christianity in India is like? And some of them were closed. Have you ever experienced discrimination because you were Christian in India? And it's either yes or no. At the end of the interview, everyone got a $20 gift card for their time, which is common practice nowadays in research protocols. I did some of them via Zoom and some of them in person. It depends on the schedule. In order to take part, you needed 3 things. 1, identify as Indian. 2, identify as Christian. And 3, be at least 18 years or older. Indian, this was a good question because I had some individuals that said, well, I identify as Indian, but I wasn't born in India. I had one participant who wasn't born in India. The participant's parents were born in India, so they were allowed to take part because they identified in India as Indian. Christian, they had to be any Christian branch whatsoever. I did have individuals who were not Christian who wanted to take part in the study or just give some information about it. And I was very touched by that, actually. They said, look, I'm not Christian, I'm actually Sikh or I'm Hindu. Can I just tell you what I think? And I said, well, I'm not going to record anything, but if we're going to have just a discussion, I could listen. And they were quite knowledgeable. I was very impressed by that. So it was a popular study, I suppose. and of course be 18 years of age or older at the time. I should note that I visited a grade 6 class a few weeks ago, and I had one student, very bright. I was talking about religion and world religions and stuff like that. He raised his hand, he said, "Sir, are you the guy that's doing this study on Christians in India?" And I said, "Yeah." He says, "Okay." So he pulls out a construction paper, piece of construction. I said, "Oh, now I'm in trouble." He pulls out a piece of a construction paper, he folds it into a card, and he wrote about all the different branches of Christianity in India. The Syro-Malabar Church, the Syro-Malankara, and I was really touched by it. I was very bright. So when I retire in a few years, he's going to be the new principal of Assumption University. So the demographics of this study, so far as I mentioned, it's ongoing. The demographics, I'm actually quite impressed with it because this number, 29.22, actually is the median age of the population in India. It's about 29.88, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. So it is reflective. They range in age from 18 to 70 years. Most of them are post-secondary, have some post-secondary education. The majority are male. 10 states are represented. 12 Christian branches. Okay, so it's a lot more complex than the Catholic and Anglican. They are very much in India, about 20 years in India. So some of them actually just came to Canada about 6 months ago. So they had a whole story to tell me about what's going on. And very few, some of them have very few years in Canada as well. And actually a few of them asked me, they said, "Sir, tell me about Christians in Canada." I said, "You want the answer, or do you want the nice answer or the not nice answer?" They said, "Not nice answer." I said, "Really, nobody cares." There's a lot of individuals that, these rivalries, they exist. I'm not saying, but they're not as bad as they were in the 1950s, where there were rivalries between different Christian groups, and some of them pointed that out as well. Yeah, Steve, go ahead.
Just to put that in perspective, average age 29. So like looking here at a 30-year-old average age of India, like that's what they use, reflective of the country itself, and that's what we have here of the immigrants.
That's right.
Isn't the average age of Canada 64.2?
It's in the 60s, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean,
Last
I
census.
just want to bring that up. I mean, you're looking here at the majority of people in India are young.
That's right.
They're young, whereas in Canada, I mean, baby boomers, due to that, I mean, the majority of Canada is over 60.
That's right. In India, one-fourth of the population is between 0 and 14 years of age. So it is very, very young. That's where they mostly are. And actually only 6.8% of Indians are over the age of 65.
And, sorry, just to extend that, because of that age, that population will grow astronomically.
That's what planned.
Whereas Canada, the majority of people in Canada are beyond childbearing years.
Yep.
So Canada will not grow nearly as fast as that country there.
That's right. And a few participants mentioned that, actually. Father Weaver.
What was your sample size?
Right now it's about 30.
Okay.
So it's small. Yeah, it's going, yeah. So I asked them several questions, and I won't go through all of them tonight, but familiarity with anti-Christian discrimination, factors, what are motivating anti-Christian discrimination, and if they've experienced it personally, if they've seen churches or other sacred sites vandalized, have they had pressure to convert, are Christian Indians a forgotten minority, hence the name of the study, and what's the future like? That's what you were talking about, Steve. What is the future like of Christians in India? So the motivation is what is exactly motivating these anti-Christian attacks? And most of the individuals said simply, it's politics. I've always noticed this in this job as chair in religion and conflict. You get a package that looks like it's all religious, but then you dig deep enough inside and it's all politics. That's essentially what's going on over here. This has turned into a political issue when it has nothing really to do with religion. It's being politicized. Religion is being politicized to the advantage of those in power. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that because we talked about a growing population in India and a very young population, but there's another problem facing said young population. There is an unemployment rate among youth that is nearing 30% in India. Okay, so that's problem number one. There's also an unemployment rate in India of approximately 21%. So, to take the focus away from those issues, high unemployment, high youth unemployment, let's focus on ancient rivalries between Hindus and Christians and Muslims and Sikhs and Buddhists in order to put the attention over there. That's essentially what's going on. Nobody wants to talk about those statistics, but we want to talk about these kinds of things, right? Another issue that's being brought up is that Christianity is seen as the religion of the colonizer. And I'm not saying that that's not true. Yes, the British, the Portuguese, the Danish, absolutely the Danes, certainly. But when you talk to individuals about this, and I've interviewed, they kind of say, well, look it, I have been Christian all my life. My family are from Kerala. We were converted centuries ago, millennia ago, by St. Thomas the Apostle and his followers. Our church is just as old as the church in Rome, and that's true, right? That's absolutely true. So the religion of the colonizers, yes, to a degree, but also there's that element that I mentioned, particularly among the Syro-Malabar Christians as well. And then most people said there was discrimination, but then there were two participants so far that said there's really not much discrimination going on in India at all towards Christians. Again, they were from the south. Okay, so that's going to be something that's going to play out throughout the conversation. Just some quotes over here. I'm going to take the middle one. There were no problems until 2010. Hindus and Christians would visit each other. Christians made donations to Hindu temples and festivals. I was pretty impressed to hear that there was this interfaith dialogue and interfaith relationship that was going on between Hindus and Christians. I was talking to one participant and he said, look it, when we had Christmas, the Hindu community would come to our church and celebrate and dance and sing with us. There wasn't a big deal. And we would go to their festivals as well. There wasn't a big deal. We would have some of their baked goods and sweets, and they would have ours. There wasn't a big deal. But now, everything is all separate, all over again. Again, a lot of this has been brought up by politics. You know, this participant said, now it's a bit sensitive. We don't even talk about it. But before, when growing up, religion, nobody really cared. You know, Hindu, Sikh, Muslim, Buddhist, Christian, okay, whatever. But now it's all become politicized, right? Now, political motivations, we talked about the socioeconomic motivations. You know, we were talking about the population size. One of the fear that the Hindu nationalists are putting forward is that Christianity is growing. The answer to that is yes, it is growing. And the concern is that if Christianity continues to grow, it's going to one day overtake Hinduism. To me, I think that's a little bit of paranoia, okay? Because you have to understand the size of the amount of Hindus in India, okay? It's anywhere between, I would say, 900 million to probably 1 billion. Christians on a good day in India would be about 30 million. So it's going to take a lot of time in order for the Christians to get to that level of another 900 million. But that's what's being peddled, and that's what's causing some fear. Another thing that's causing fear, again, is going back to the missionary work, public baptisms, mass conversions, and to Christianity. This is getting concerns from the government to the point that the government has now legislated against mass conversions in some of the states as well. Again, we talked about the caste system. Converting in order to escape the caste system. That's why Christianity is attractive. That's why Islam is attractive, because of the caste system. Not having that caste system, I should say. Again, somebody pointed out that it's about being liberated, again, which kind of goes back to this caste system idea, right? That the Christians would encourage education and being self-sufficient and independence, which would then support what's going on with the liberation from the caste system. So it's a lot more complex than what we just believe. Now, experienced discrimination, which is it's a good thing to note, that only 5 of the participants so far have said they've experienced discrimination. Some of it relates to teasing, you know, high school teasing. Some have actually talked about if you eat beef, then some people are going to look at you like, what are you doing? You know, because you're not supposed to do that in Hinduism. And actually some of it has been quite severe about housing issues, that people have been literally discriminated against from moving into certain neighborhoods because they're Christian. So this is becoming an issue. What I find fascinating, and I thought I stumbled on a little pattern here, but it didn't work out, was that the 5 participants who experienced discrimination all came from states outside of Kerala. So I thought, okay, well, Kerala is kind of like this safe zone for Christianity. It didn't work out that way when we moved on. Although Kerala does have the largest number of Christians in the entire country, about over 6 million, it didn't work out when we get to some other issues as well. Vandalism. There's been a lot of reports of vandalism, and even the vandalism has taken place in Kerala, in churches in Kerala and Tamil Nadu, where there's a sizable Syro-Malabar and Catholic churches across the board. Again, this is not just occurring in the north. It's occurring everywhere, unfortunately. When I did this study, a lot of participants said, yeah, I heard about that, but that happens in the north of India. That doesn't happen in the south. When it came to vandalism, they said, yeah, even churches in Kerala have been vandalized as well. A few issues of vandalism. There's some statues of the Virgin Mary in a glass case. People have thrown stones at them. Churches have been graffitied. St. George is quite popular in India, and some of those statues have also been destroyed as well. So there's some problems going on with destruction. As I mentioned already here, destruction particularly of Mary, graffiti, cemeteries, even some desecration of cemeteries as well. Now the pressure to convert, this is what actually prompted this whole study. I asked participants this question, if they've experienced any pressure to convert. So far, only 2 of them said that they would. But before I want to get to that, there are penalties in place for converting. 12 out of the 28 states in India, and then they have the 6 union territories, 8 union territories, have anti-conversion laws. So there are laws that prohibiting it. And what can happen is fined from anywhere from 15,000 to 50,000 rupees, which is a few American $100, right? Or prison sentences, which is much more severe than the fine over here of 1 to 10 years. So what's motivating this? Well, a lot of it has to do with the mass conversions that were going on in India, but also the fear that there's coercion and fraud and all that being used in order to convert people from religion X to Christianity. And if you convert someone who's older, who is younger, or a woman, the penalty is considered aggravating, and this will likely increase to the higher end rather than the lower end. So there are some concerns about conversion that's going on in India.
A question about the anti-conversion laws. Is that from any religion to any religion, or specifically to Christianity?
It's any religion to any religion. Yeah. So it's not just Christianity. It's also Hinduism. Islam. That's another issue as well, and Sikhism. Michael.
Maybe I'll wait, John. I don't want to disrupt the pattern. I'll wait.
Okay, no problem. So I mentioned there was only 2 people in the sample, and I know the sample is still growing, but there are only 2 people in the sample that said that they experienced pressure to convert. One of them said, well, why don't you come back to temple? Why don't you go to temple? And the participant said, well, I'm actually never went to temple. I'm Christian. So there was, well, you should come to temple, this kind of pressure like that, right? Another case was actually not really much to do with the study, but has been picked up by the BJP. It was an individual who said, yeah, they pressured me to convert. I said, okay, well, do you want to share? And the participant says, yeah, well, you see, I'm Christian, and I was dating a Muslim girl. And I said, okay, I think I know where this is going. And he said, well, her dad wanted me to convert to Islam, and I said no, and my dad wanted me to stay Christian, and I said, okay, I get the point. That happens all the time, but that wasn't similar to what we were looking at. What I did find interesting about the sample is the participants were very much aware of what was going on. They did know about the anti-conversion laws. They did know about the penalties for the conversion laws, but they haven't experienced it themselves. Again, most of the participants did come, I would say, from the southern half of India, not those just 2 southern states. So could it be more severe in the northern parts, as what some of them have said? Possibly. Now, the forgotten minority question, I asked, do you think Christians are a forgotten minority in India? Hence the name of the study. And yes, the majority of them believe they are a forgotten minority. The government tends not to focus on Christians at all. The argument is that we don't form a strong voting bloc, that we only form about 30 million people, and that the government, whoever the government is, either the BJP or the Congress, is not really interested enough. Well, we saw in the election a couple last week that things kind of changed a little bit, right? Interesting that the participants mentioned that they are a forgotten minority. Not so much the government doesn't care about the Christians, but that the government is actually focused on the other two major religious minorities in the country. One being Muslims, who are largely in the north, but spread throughout the country. And you have to understand that India has a Muslim population of about 175 million. It's just a few percentages, but as I mentioned, it's a big drop, right? And then, of course, the Sikh community, which is slightly smaller than the Christian community. They're about anywhere between 20 to 25 million. So there's been some issues with the communities. As you remember, 40 years ago, Operation Blue Star under Indira Gandhi, when the Golden Temple at Amritsar was stormed and led to her assassination later on. That was a significant turning point in Indian politics. And then, of course, the issue with Jammu and Kashmir, which is now a union territory in the north of India, and the dispute between, well, it's not just India and Pakistan, it's also a dispute between India and China as well over that state as well. So I can see what the participants were trying to say. There were some that said maybe. It depends on where you are. If you're in the north, then you're a forgotten minority. If you're in the south, you're not forgotten. So I thought that was interesting to note. Again, the north-south divide, which is something that needs to go on. Others that said, no, we're not a forgotten minority because we have scholarships that are particularly attached to Christians. And that space is reserved for us, and keep in mind this is in the south, in universities. And we have a lot of churches growing. And we have a lot of Christian colleges and universities in India, which there are more Christian colleges and universities in India than there are in Canada. I know that for a fact. So there was some discrepancy on this question. Now the question that caused the most discrepancy was the future. What's going to be the future for, and you can see it's pretty much divided, and I recognize the sample is still growing, but at the same time, about 29% believe that there's a positive future for Christians because the population of Christians is growing. That's true. Others think it's going to be a negative future because of the political sphere. And keep in mind, I was doing the interviews before the election, and many of the participants were saying to me that Prime Minister Modi's government is going to get an even bigger majority than he already had at the time. No one said that he was going to lose the majority and it was going to turn into a minority, which has essentially happened. So they had that very negative belief because it was right at the cusp of the election. And then a lot of them were very uncertain. Some of them pointed to the Christian community itself, which I thought was interesting. They said if the Christians are faithful, then they will have a positive future. If the Christians take a better part and a better role in their faith, then it's going to be a brighter future. So it wasn't just outside forces. It was also looking within the community, the leadership of the community and the members in the community that needed to be more Christian.